Ja, zeker. Het zal niet zijn. Het is weer. Ja,
zeker dat weet ik.
Niks is zeker.
Nee, maar het is niks.
Wat is er dan van? Ah nee joh, dat is goed. Het is allemaal niet zo serieus. Je hebt toch erg druk met jullie, toch? Je bent ouder. Ik weet al wat het probleem is. Hij heeft geen restaurant, geen hotel aan. Hey, zingt toch? Ja, ja, maar ik heb nu gewoon geen rest. Als ik voor sta, heb ik wel ergens. Ja, nou, dat zit er al. Maar ik heb er net al even aan de andere kant gezien. Liz? Komt er iets uit? Ja, ik hoorde het nog.
So you hear already?
Yeah, you heard the native music.
Yeah.
Oh.
Wonderful.
And you can adjust the volume by yourself.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Next test. Now I know when to go.
Do you know when to go?
I have the their route is right into yours. I can do their stage.
Okay, so you'll do you then want to give me the heads up when they get out there?
Yeah.
Or I kind of want to send him out. I want to send Ian out there with like 3 minutes, give us an extra minute. I have no idea. It doesn't look like they're going anytime soon. because they were like, we can't find Heather, and so they were like running for it.
Okay.
They were like, we're starting on time with or without her. I was like, you actually can't start without your mom. Okay, look, the room is getting full. See, I wish that I was standing here, like that right next to you, and calling the show from over here, so you came over there.
Can't do
It's probably easier.
Yeah, you should.
Then we're not relaying that many times, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Who sits here though?
No one.
No one? You know, can I put the two mics here?
Yes.
Okay, then let's do that. Let's do that.
Why are they still playing music, Nato? Okay.
They're not ready yet.
Okay.
Oh. What called?
Spanish. They are in Spain or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's typical for Spain. Good food, good for a holiday, but for the rest.
Running late. Oh.
Sorry. Just so that I can see the screens, I have to call it from here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, look, guys, get on the board.
Kill the music.
No, I'm just seeing lines I'm seeing activity on that side. Okay.
I think they're still. I still hear music. They're not going yet.
What?
Whoa.
Trust delayed by traffic beginning with 2 p.m. Okay.
Okay.
Hold on. They are going to?
I can also see the interview. Are we playing our stinger too?
But they don't intro video, then
They cut music.
they do a short introduction, don't they?
Yeah. So we do interview when we do their interview, then Ian goes up.
Yeah, but this is a short introduction,
Yeah, after the interview.
right?
After the interview. Yeah, there's that.
Yes, please.
See?
Yes.
Stand by.
We're about to start.
victory for peace.
Please welcome the Vice President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the final day of Brussels Forum 2022. And this is going to be a rather unusual day, actually, in many ways. As we've been here, and actually over the last weeks and months as we've been planning for Brussels Forum, there's been another event we've been planning for, and that's one that we're doing alongside the NATO summit directly, in fact, in Madrid, at the NATO Public Forum. And you're going to have an opportunity to see the sessions from that live. We've been partnering with NATO, of course, but also with the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, with the Atlantic Council, and with the Munich Security Conference to do this. This is something we've done many times in the past, and it's obviously a very important year and a very important summit. You'll have an opportunity to hear our President, Heather Conley, moderating first a conversation with three heads of state and one foreign minister, the Prime Minister of Belgium, the Prime Minister of Australia, Liz Truss, the Foreign Minister of Britain, and the Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez. And you'll have an opportunity to participate in those conversations as well. So I'm going to turn right now to Heather, who's coming to us live from Madrid. Thanks.
With some extraordinary voices to help us think through this new era. But I would be remiss if I did not say NATO is in such a stronger position today to face that era of great power competition because we are about to welcome 2 new members into our family. So ladies and gentlemen, let's just celebrate this historic moment in welcoming Sweden and Finland into NATO. Belgian Prime Minister De Croo and I were talking in the back, and we were saying, you know, we get so busy doing the work, we don't take that moment to say, we are here as part of history, and that is very exciting. So we are waiting for British Foreign Secretary Truss, who is in traffic and will be coming here, but we are going to start unpacking NATO in an era of great power competition. First, we're going to begin with Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. I'm going to confess to you all, the Prime Minister and I have had a chance to have a conversation earlier this week at the Brussels Forum. So we are a little practiced in this conversation. But Prime Minister Albanese, watch out. You're going to be pulled in here. But Prime Minister, let me begin with you, because I think the challenge is not the great power competition. We understand that. I believe, and you can press me if you don't agree, I believe the challenge is our competing geopolitical demands. So I'm going to put this more clearly. What's more important is China, the pacing challenge. That is the great power that we have to pay attention to. Or quite frankly, over the last 4 months, it has been clear that Russia is the challenge, that if we do not get this challenge correct, we cannot get the Indo-Pacific correct. So, Prime Minister De Croo, let me begin with you. How do you think about the greatest security challenges of our time? How do you balance the competing demands of Russia now, obviously for NATO and collective defense, but yet China and the looming challenges of the Indo-Pacific?
I think it would be a mistake to put Russia and China in the same basket. I think it's a very different situation. The Russian challenge is an immediate one, and it's a direct threat to our Western way of life. Because in the end, we have a war on the European continent, but it's much broader than just this war in Ukraine. There is an energy war as well, which is impacting the entirety of the world. There is a disinformation campaign and destabilization campaigns. There is Belarus abusing of refugee flows to try to destabilize Lithuania. So our way of life, the Western way of life, is under gigantic pressure. And the answer, I mean, what kind of an answer have we given as a European Union? And countries are lining up to join the European Union, so it's clear that as European Union, besides soft power and hard power, we also have what I would call seductive power. I mean, maybe we forgot how to seduce because of COVID, because we were afraid one of another. But we are
That's
attractive.
soft power. That's
As a European Union, we are attractive. And look at what NATO has done. I mean, some thought, you know, NATO will be fragmented, will not be able to stick together. It's actually quite the opposite. And indeed, as you said at the start, what a historic moment with Finland and Sweden, countries who were not member of NATO for a specific reason, who understood that in the world of today, if you're alone in the world of today, it's not a good situation to be in. Countries who are alone today, or they're afraid, or they're on their way to join NATO. And we are extremely happy to be able to welcome them and to welcome them at this summit. From my perspective, this summit already is a success. I mean, we still have work to do, but that element, that message that you give to European population and to the rest of the world, especially to Russia, that message could not be clearer.
Strength and unity. Mr. Prime Minister, I want to just press you on thing. I do not know what the strategic concept will say. We are all eager to read it. But what press reports are suggesting, and NATO Secretary Stoltenberg has suggested that the document may say that China poses a challenge to NATO's interests, security, and values. But you would agree with that, although you're not saying that China and Russia are equated. You would agree that China poses a challenge to NATO's interests, security, and values?
Well, look, from a European perspective, China is a partner. In some domains, we're partners. In fighting climate change, we are a partner. In fighting the pandemic, we were a partner. B, China is a competitor. On the economic side, it's a fierce competitor, but competition pushes us to be on the top of our toes. And C, they're a rival. And that's quite clear that in a lot of domains they are a rival. But so it is a country that challenges us, obviously. I think it's good that in the new strategic concept that China is part of that analysis. But our relation with China is one on different. I also think that the response we have given to Russia on the aggression on Ukraine is a message related to other security threats that could happen in other places of the world related to China.
Okay, fantastic. It's a great segue to welcome Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese with us. First of all, congratulations on your election and welcome to your first NATO summit. This is very exciting as a partner. Someone who observes China very keenly, I would love your perspective on how you see this era of great power competition as a great partner of NATO, and really how you see this era of great power competition and the competing demands, particularly in China, for the Indo-Pacific and in Europe these days. How do you balance those as Prime Minister?
I think back in Australia, there'd be some people saying, why is the Australian Prime Minister at a NATO conference in Madrid? And it's because one of the things that's really been brought home by recent global events, whether it be the pandemic was a reminder, various cyber issues a reminder, but also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has had an impact on our power prices, it's had an impact on global supply chains. It's a reminder that the days of thinking that you can compartmentalise, oh, well, that's an Asia-Pacific issue, that's a European issue, are over, if ever that was real. And that's why we have a direct interest in what is going on in Ukraine, in the consequences of the brutal Russian invasion. That's why Australia is the largest non-NATO contributor to support sovereignty in Ukraine, with $285 million so far of defence support and $65 million of humanitarian support. It's because Australia understands very much that what is playing out there has consequences in our own region. If an authoritarian state can attack a sovereign national state and seek to enforce its will through brutal military power, then that has implications for the entire region. Now, Australia is in the part of the world that's the subject of strategic competition with the rise of China, the US's historic role, but also the important role that various European powers have played as well, France, Spain, the UK, in our region. And that's why what is happening in Ukraine has to be viewed in that context, and why in terms of a global order and the norms of international engagement are being tested here. And the resolve of the world is being tested as well. Does the world say, well, this has been going on for a while, so we'll begin to withdraw our support for the struggle that's going on now on the ground in Ukraine? Or do we say, no, that is something that we have to step up for? And I think it's very much the latter. And it is being watched in our region, where we have China, who we want peaceful and stable relations with, but the truth is that China has been more forward-leaning into the region. We've seen an agreement between the Solomons and China in our region that is potentially of some concern. And my government in the last month has very much reached out to make sure that we continue to remind, for example, our Pacific Island neighbours that our support comes without strings attached. We're good neighbours. We are historically the security partner of choice in the Pacific, along with our friends. But it is something that we can't take for granted. So whereas I think historically it's fair to say that most Australians wouldn't have thought greatly about Ukraine, they are thinking now. And there's bipartisan support for the commitments that have been made. President Zelensky addressed our Parliament on the last sitting day, on the day of my budget reply as opposition leader. And there is support for us to continue to engage. And across the political spectrum, there's certainly very broad support for my presence here at NATO. And I think that it has been, thank you to NATO and its leadership, Jens Stoltenberg in particular, for reaching out and making sure that the Asia-Pacific leaders, not just myself, but Japan, Korea and New Zealand, are here present as well, which just sends that message to the world as well as specifically to our region, that it matters what happens here.
Strengthen numbers, strengthen unity. And I think it's equally interesting. The Indonesian president is visiting President Zelensky in Kyiv right now, so that Indo-Pacific element here with Ukraine. Mr. Prime Minister, let me ask you, because you gave an interview before traveling to Madrid, saying that you believe the Chinese government had some lessons to learn from Russia's strategic failure. And I was hoping I could pull that out a little bit, because what do you believe, following obviously politics, domestic internal issues in Beijing so closely, what do you think Beijing is internalizing with allied resolve and response to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that objectively, certainly in Australia, when you saw from one perspective, you have Russia, which has been historically a very powerful nation state, versus Ukraine, historically not as powerful. I think there was a perception that this would be over relatively quickly. There was also a perception that there might be some argument, not about substance, but about process and contribution. And what we've seen is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has produced a more united world in terms of democratic nations and a resolve that is strong and clear, and I believe will be decisive as well. And that's a very positive message, that the attack on a sovereign nation won't be just regarded as being just about Ukraine. It is about the way that the UN Charter is implemented. It is about the international rule of law, and if it is allowed to be subjugated by brute force, then that does have implications for the region. And I'm absolutely certain that China, in terms of the context here, as Russian forces were being mobilised around borders while Olympic Games were going on, you had the Partnership Without Limits signed between China and Russia, and that was part of the process leading up to the Russian invasion, and that, I think, shows how interconnected
Absolutely.
China and Russia were. And in terms of the resolve, though, and the response, it I think, has been so strong. Yep. And the two new potential members of NATO just reinforces that, absolutely, I think, in the last 24 hours. Indeed.
Well, we are delighted to welcome British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss here with us. Perfect timing. No, you're perfect. And in fact, this is a perfect segue into the question that I was going to ask you as well, Foreign Secretary, because right before coming here, you also gave an interview about the lessons that you believe allies are learning, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, how they're watching this. And I'd love to pull that thought out, if you don't mind. What do you believe Taiwan, what do you believe the Chinese government is learning from allied unity and resolve over Ukraine today?
Thank you.
Oops, I think your microphone is, are we working?
Is the microphone working?
Don't think so. If not, that's right. There's a backup plan. That's a good backup plan. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, it's absolutely imperative that we secure Russia's defeat in Ukraine. And it's imperative for the sake of European security, freedom, and democracy. And it's the only way that we are going to achieve a lasting peace in Europe. There are some who are saying that there could be some possibility of negotiations now, whilst Russia is still in Ukraine. But I think that would bring a false peace, and it would lead to further aggression in the future. And we have to learn the lessons of the past, the failures of the Minsk Protocol, for example, in being able to secure a lasting peace in the area. So my very strong message is we have to defeat Russia first and negotiate later. And I completely agree with the Australian Prime Minister that we need to think very carefully about the messages we're sending to President Xi. We've seen increased collaboration between Russia and China, and we know that China is watching Ukraine closely. They're expanding their military capability, and they're extending their global influence. And one significant thing today is that we will see in the new strategic concept put out by NATO specific reference to China, because it isn't just an issue for the Indo-Pacific region, it's also an issue for Euro-Atlantic security. And I do think that with China extending its influence through economic coercion and building a capable military, there is a real risk that they draw the wrong idea, which results in a catastrophic miscalculation, such as invading Taiwan. And that is exactly what we saw in the case of Ukraine, a strategic miscalculation by Putin. So this is why it's so important that the free world work together to help ensure that Taiwan is able to defend itself and to stress the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan states. And what we're doing is making sure that Taiwan has meaningful participation in international organizations, but also working to strengthen our economic ties with Taiwan, because this isn't just about hard security, It's also about economic security. I think the lesson we've learnt also from the Ukraine crisis is the increased dependency of Europe on Russian oil and gas contributed to a sense in which Russia felt enabled to invade Ukraine because they knew it would be very difficult for Europe to respond. So we also need to learn that lesson, I believe, with China of not becoming strategically dependent on China and, in fact, making sure that we have strong alternatives. And not just that the free world has strong alternatives, that also allies such as the Pacific Islands that the Prime Minister was talking about, allies in Southeast Asia, allies in Africa and the Caribbean also have alternatives to China's economic investment. And people will have seen at the G7 the announcement of $600 billion worth of investment through the Global Partnership for Infrastructure Investment Program. And I think that's a very important alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there are huge lessons we can learn, and we need to learn them as soon as possible.
Foreign Secretary, before you arrived, we were challenging ourselves on how we balance the competing geopolitical demands, and this is sort of my who comes first. Is China the pacing challenge, and we need to stabilize the situation in Europe to focus on China? As you said, the game is right now. If we don't get this right in Ukraine, and Ukraine wins and prevails, the international system is a very different system for all of us to work at. And I know the Strategic Defense and Security Review had that balance of focusing on Europe, Russia, collective defense, but that tilt to the Indo-Pacific. Help me understand how the government is balancing these competing needs, which take enormous resources, military, economic, and of course, diplomatic investment.
Well, the answer is we have to do both. They're indivisible. And anything that happens that affects Euro-Atlantic security has a negative knock-on effect on Indo-Pacific security and vice versa. That is why it's so important that we have partners like Australia, like South Korea, here at our NATO conference in Europe. And the way I see it as working, and this is very important in the Indo-Pacific region, is of course countries like Australia are much better versed in the region. This is their neighborhood, Japan as well. So we also need to work through allies, through collaborations like AUKUS, through the Blue Pacific Partnership that we've just launched with the US, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. And I see it as a network of freedom-loving countries that work together, share expertise, share experience, do things like joint military training. We had the recent deployment of the Carrier Strike Group out in the Indo-Pacific. But we clearly all have specialist expertise in our own neighborhood. So one of the things we've been doing in Ukraine is helping Australia deliver aid into Ukraine through UK routes. So I think we can very effectively work together, but that requires us all as allies is, first of all, to be more economically open. The UK is currently working to join the CPTPP, so we can trade more with the Asia-Pacific region. I would like to see our American colleagues do that as well.
I second that.
And our European colleagues. We also need to be following through on investment, because for too long, the pitch has been left clear to Russia or China to provide security support, to provide investment support. And we know that that is leading countries down the wrong path. So we need to be actively engaged, and we need to work with each other to do that.
Prime Minister Takor, I want to bring you in because I know you want to jump in on that, but I want to give a question, and this is like the rapid fire response. So we are united. We see the challenges of both. The network is growing of like-mindeds, but we also see a greater alignment between China and Russia. The U.S. just sanctioned 5 Chinese companies for supporting Russia's military yesterday. How do you see, very quickly, this converging alignment? Is it substantial? Is it convenient? They get a vote here, and how does that work? But Prime Minister Takor, you want to jump in perhaps on what the Foreign Secretary said, and then, but answer that quick question as well for all three, the Sino-Russian engagement.
First on that, I mean, I would not overemphasize the scale of that so-called alignment. I think there's as many topics on which they are completely misaligned as that the topics that they try to push forward where they are aligned. But I think we have to be extremely clear towards China is that any active support to the aggression of Russia in Ukraine will not go unanswered. I think we have to be extremely clear on that. But on that so-called alliance, I mean, the economic cloud of Russia, it's less than the Benelux. So it's less than Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And we are moderately small countries. So economically, and that compared to China, I mean, how can that be really a sustainable partnership? I mean, it's something like this compared to something gigantic. So it's completely unbalanced. And I think that also in economic and in strategic interest, at some point, it will be unbalanced. So when we see alignment happening, we should point it out, and it cannot go without a reaction. But in the longer run, I'm not so convinced of that. The other point I wanted to make is that, look, we say Ukraine has to win the war. And there's no doubt on that. Now the question is how? Because, I mean, this might be something that takes a lot of time. And there's different ways of ending a war. As you said, negotiating, but I mean, not in this situation. And to negotiate, it's hard to negotiate with a wall because there's no one there to negotiate. And in any case, not in the current circumstances. Second way is with economic sanctions. Now, the economic sanctions, they take time. They hurt on the Russian side. They're hurting here as well. Sure. And the key point remains, you can do foreign policy and you could do geopolitics as long as your domestic population is still supporting it. And that, I think, is going to be our main challenge in the months to come, is to protect our population for the effects of what is happening. And that will demand incredible effort from all of us and incredible coordination from all of us, which leaves us to the third element on how this war can be ended is on the battlefield. And that means that supporting Ukraine with weapons delivery, and I think the three of us have done our part in that. But that is going to be the path, the only path that will lead to the outcome that we want. And it means that we will have to increase in a dramatic way the support to the Ukrainian, to our Ukrainian friends.
Absolutely. Mr. Prime Minister, very quickly on Sino-Russian alignment.
Well, China seeks to be the most powerful nation in the world. That's what we're seeing playing out here. That's not, you can have different perspectives on that as well, but China seeks through that as well to reach out in opportunistic ways, whether it be some common sense of a lack of values, as I would see it, that they have in common with Russia in terms of a lack of democratic values that they have, an authoritarian streak, and just as Russia seeks to recreate a sort of Russian or Soviet empire, the Chinese regime is seeking friends, whether it be Russia or in the region, through financial, through economic support to build up alliances and to undermine what has historically been the Western alliance in places like the Indo-Pacific. So it's got to be seen in that context as well, which is why Australia, along with our friends here in Nato, see that we need to reassert our values in return. Australia's currently subject of economic coercion from China with sanctions of everything from coal to wine to barley to meat. And we assert with the change of government that our values don't change. Our capacity to trade off our values for short-term economic interest will not be done either. We assert that those sanctions, there's no basis for it and they should be removed. So we want good relations with our major trading partner has been China. But what that means as well is that the world, part of the response to China and Russia coming together has to be trade diversification in our case has to be greater economic strength. That's one of the reasons why one of the discussions I've been having over the last couple of days here is the Australia-European trade agreement needs to be progressed. Like-minded countries need to engage with each other and support each other, because that's happening for the non-democratic world. The democratic world has to respond.
Absolutely. Foreign Secretary, I'd love your thoughts very quickly on the Sino-Russian alignment and how concerned you are about that, right? And whether it's in international organizations like the Security Council or military exercises in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, it's certainly very worrying that China is now making statements about NATO, it's making statements about the sovereignty of the Falklands Islands, and really moving from the Indo-Pacific sphere to also challenge, and this is why it's so important NATO responds with our strategic concept that specifically references China. It's also very clear that Russia is the junior partner in this relationship, and I think that should give pause for thought to countries like India. And I do think there is an opportunity, as well as working more closely with our Australian friends, and we created a blueprint of a trade deal that now can be used with the European Union Prime Minister, and joining CPTPP. We are negotiating a trade deal with India. I know Australia has already done that as well. So I think there is an opportunity, when we see the alignment of these two authoritarian regimes, for democracies, for free nations to work more closely together. And I think more countries now see the imperative of doing that. And it's no longer good enough to look inward and to be protectionist or defensive. We need to reach outward and create that network of liberty of fellow like-minded countries. And if you look at the G7, which I think has been a real force in this conflict, the G7 has been the coordinating body for sanctions. People said it couldn't be done, but we've now delivered over 6 waves of sanctions on Russia. We represent 50% of GDP. And if you add friends like Australia and South Korea, it's even more than that. And we need to use that economic weight to challenge that coercive behavior. So if one of our number is targeted with coercion, the entire free world and those economies can respond. And I think historically we haven't used that economic power. We've been equidistant, if you like, in terms of who we trade with, who we work with. And I think countries are becoming much more focused now on, is this trade with trust? Do we trust this partner? Are they going to use it to undermine us, or are they going to use it for the mutual benefit of both of our economies? So trade has got a lot more geopolitical, as well as the security relationships we're developing too.
Can I just make this point as well? What's playing out in Sri Lanka at the moment should cause pause for thought as well. We have an economic catastrophe playing out there. China using that to assert political influence. And it should be I agree with what the Foreign Secretary has said in terms of using our economic influence. China seeks to use its economic power in a very overt way. And when we've seen a withdrawal, strategic errors by Australia at one stage with a withdrawal of foreign aid or a reduction in the region, what we saw is a step in. Yeah. So we can't have any stepping back because the void will be filled, and it'll be filled with strings. And I think our approach towards development, I think that the G7 decision of just the past couple of days to provide an alternative infrastructure framework as well for development is something that is very much welcomed.
Mr. Prime Minister, I think you're absolutely right. I think we're hearing that strong networks of security and economics and our values, this is how NATO and our NATO partners are going to win the era of great power competition. So colleagues, we're going to swing now and warmly welcome Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez to give us some closing remarks. So please join me in welcoming the Prime Minister, if he's here. Somewhere. If not, we're going to have a bonus round. I think he's coming. Oh, maybe not. All right, well, he will. We'll give him another round of applause when he arrives. I think it's very hard to be a host, and you have so many wonderful guests and pulled so many ways, but we do want to hear his wisdom. Well, I think it's striking, though, of this conversation. Obviously, we're here to talk about security and enhancing that, but what you three spent a great deal of your time talking about is geoeconomic strength and how allies and trusted allies, we tend to focus on China and their economic strength. We have our great strength too, and we need to redouble that. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen calls that friend shoring. I love that term. We need more friends. We need to strengthen our friendship. Oh, yep, please. Also, I think we're going to ad lib here for a second until the Prime Minister
I think comes. One of the points that I make as well is that from Australia's perspective in the region, we can't compete in terms of some of the dollars that are going in. What we can compete is on values, and one of the values is climate change, climate action. And my government's change of position on climate, and being more aligned with global efforts, has changed the dynamic of our engagement with our Pacific Island friends, because for them, it's an existential threat. It is front and centre. And it is through looking at areas like that of asserting our values that we can compete as well.
Absolutely. Well, and now we can do this again. Would you please all welcome Prime Minister Sanchez? Mr. Prime Minister, you can come right up here. Thank you so much. We've come to all our conclusions, and so we'll just need your pearls of wisdom. Thank you so much. Now, please.
Buenos días. Thank you very much, Minister, Prime Ministers, also the community of Elcano. Thank you very much for this wonderful conference. Let me begin by saying that this summit represents, as the Secretary General of NATO has stated, a historic landmark for NATO. It is a historic summit because of the difficult context in which it is taking place, marked by an unjust and illegal war against Ukraine. And it is also historic because of the decisions that allies will take over the next couple of days. We must provide the alliance with the adequate tools to be able to respond vigorously to the challenges of our time. So Madrid will also be remembered for the enlargement of NATO. In 1997, also in Madrid, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland were invited to start accession talks. On this occasion, thanks to the agreement reached last evening, Sweden and Finland, two strong democracies, two European democracies have now a path for accession. This is an excellent news, and I would like to congratulate all parties involved in the negotiation for making it possible. They are two strong democracies, and they will make our alliance stronger. The first decision of this summit, and perhaps the most important one, is the endorsement of a new strategic concept which will lead our way to the coming decade. The Madrid strategic concept will prepare NATO for the uncertain future ahead. We are living through tumultuous times, and we will have to face the future decisively, responding to new competitors and to the re-emergence of others. Today's challenges are now limited to the conventional military sphere, as evidenced by the growing importance of the so-called hybrid threats, the climate crisis, the food emergency, among many others. Second, we will reinforce our deployment in the eastern flank, as we are dealing with the most worrisome security threat for Europe since the end of the Cold War. Third, during the next 2 days, we will adopt important decisions regarding the development of new instruments that will allow us to innovate and conduct research so that we are better prepared with the state-of-the-art capabilities. And fourth, all of these initiatives will require funding, which is why another critical discussions during the summit will be related to a new common funding scheme that will secure the means for NATO to fulfill its mission. All in all, my dear friends, these decisions will shape the vision, the force, posture, and the resources of the organizations for the years to come. Perhaps what really makes this summit historical is that throughout the 2 days of discussions, we will be answering to the following question. What type of NATO do we want to grant peace and stability in the coming years? The answer, of course, depends on the diagnostic about the current geopolitical context, as well as the forecast of what lies ahead of us. And that is where great power competition comes in. We cannot say that competition among great powers is something new, but what defines this area is the changing balance between powers that has followed the relative decline of some and the emergence of others. And this new balance of power and the resulting multipolar world creates new frictions. Yet, what is more concerning is that is the fact that the current geopolitical shifts are deeply questioning the very nature of the global security architecture that has been so carefully crafted over the past 7 decades. It is clear that we will have to deal with new threats, conflicting interests, and new tensions between nations. What we cannot tolerate is that countries violate the international rules-based system as enshrined in the UN Charter. The war in Ukraine represents an attack to the rules-based international order. The basic principles that grant peaceful coexisting among nations, such as state sovereignty or territorial integrity, among others, have been dramatically infringed. This is why today, together from Madrid, we are sending a very strong and clear message to Putin. You will not win. The rules-based international order will prevail. Ukraine will prevail, and peace will prevail. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the first confrontation between two conventional armies in Europe since the Second World War. In barely 4 months, it has produced tectonic change in Europe. Sweden and Finland have broken with their historical neutrality and have asked to join NATO. Denmark has abandoned its exclusion clause and is joining the Europe of defense. Germany has abandoned its traditional position of containing military spending. Many countries recognize the need to increase defense spending and plan to do so as soon as possible. In some, the European security architecture is drastically changing and almost at the speed of light. But let me be clear about our goals. We want peace and security. Therefore, we need an Atlantic alliance that provides it, as it has been doing for almost 950 million people since its inception. So it is now time that we strengthen our alliance so that we can face together the current threats to security. We must reflect upon and decide what instruments we need to address the new threats and challenges. The good news is that we are not alone. NATO is working closely with like-minded countries. We are happy to have the Prime Minister of Australia here, among others, as is well reflected by the participation during the summit of 11 invited countries, 8 of which are at leaders level. In this summit, we are strengthening our ties with our partners in the East, the South, and in the Indo-Pacific. I also truly believe that in order to adapt the transatlantic security system to face the new challenges, we must strengthen the relations between the European Union and NATO, making the complementary to one another. This is why tonight we will have, for the first time ever, an informal Euro-Atlantic dinner at the Prado Museum. For the first time, I repeat, we will bring together allies, the member states of the European Union, and the European Union and NATO institutions. I know one thing for sure, which is that we want peace, stability, certainty. We must work together and put the necessary means for the alliance to provide such peace, stability, and certainty for our societies. The war in Ukraine, my dear friends, has taught us that we cannot take them for granted. We must strive to uphold them. So thank you very much. Congratulations to El Instituto del Cano, and thank you very much for the participation of this panel of leaders at the European level and global level. Thank you very much.
Well, colleagues, thank you very much. Stay in your seats. Don't go anywhere. Please, but thank again the Prime Ministers and Foreign Secretary for joining us. Thank you. And so now we will transition.
Well, welcome back here in Brussels, but also now both in Brussels and in Madrid, live from both places, to continue our conversation on NATO in an era of great power competition. And here we're very pleased to have with us Carl Bildt, David Ignatius, Alice Ekman in our studio here in Brussels. And in Madrid, we will have Julia Ioffe and also Luis Simon. And we're delighted also to have our president, Heather Conley, moderating that conversation. Heather, over to you.
And there it broke down.
Why don't we invite our speakers to have a seat? Alice, Carl, absolutely. There we go. It's really a great opportunity to be able to do this, and you can well imagine that linking these two things together is not always the simplest of things, but we have a wonderful group on each end, and they will be with us very shortly to continue the conversation. They have some more things to move around there in the middle of the summit, so we'll be able to do that. Let's see. I think I'm hearing music from them, but in any case, you know, what I maybe just to reflect just on the last remarks from the Prime Minister of Spain, David, if if there was anything that struck you, maybe that last point he made about NATO EU, from an American perspective, just to anticipate our conversation a little bit before Heather joins us. Give us a thought.
So I found the discussion from Madrid strong and very much to the point in dealing with Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The essence of the NATO alliance is Article 5, the commitment to protect NATO members, to, in this case, assist a non-NATO member in defending against aggression. I think that's been strengthened. The move east, the further expansion of NATO forces, clear, very much to the point. The new strategic concept and its references to the Indo-Pacific, I'm less clear about. The heart of NATO is Article 5 and the commitment to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. The heart of American policy in the Indo-Pacific as regards Taiwan, the key issue, continues to be one of strategic ambiguity, the opposite of Article 5. Blurring those two is a mistake, and there's a need, I think, for much greater discussion and clarity before NATO moves aggressively into this Indo-Pacific space.
Okay. And I know we're going to get to, we have different facets of this conversation we're going to be able to get to as they come with us in a minute from Madrid. I mean, Alice, I know you focus very much on China, and we're going to talk a lot about that. I don't want to anticipate that too much, but just have you heard enough about China in this conversation yet?
I think China is in everyone's mind and always come back to the conversation. So I was very interested to follow the previous panel because it was not about China, but China-Russia, to what extent the alignment is there, to what extent it's long-term, to what extent it's security-based. My perspective is that we underestimated the level of rapprochement between Beijing and Moscow since 2014, which is much more than a matter of convenience. I can elaborate on that during our actual session, but I think it's very important to remind that, and also to remind that it's not all about economic rationality. You know, trade volume between EU and Russia is much larger than between China and Russia, but it doesn't really lead to a readjustment of Beijing's position toward Moscow, and that's very important to keep in mind.
So thank you. And Carl, if I could, just very briefly, before we go to Heather, it's one thing to have in kind of theory this balance between a focus on China as a competitor and a focus on the immediate problem with Russia. But if you're right up close to that problem, as Sweden is, obviously, and as the Baltic states are, is it possible to keep that sort of balance? Or is it inevitable that the center of gravity of NATO concern is going to be on Russia, on the defense of the Baltics, and elsewhere for years to come?
Well, I mean, the center of attention of NATO is to deter aggression against any of the member states from anyone. I mean, if China were to threaten to occupy Iceland, I'm just saying theoretical, then China would be the main threat. But at the moment, I think it is fairly obvious that it is Russia that is the main threat. We don't really see the possibility of anyone else at the moment threatening the territorial integrity of any of the member states of NATO. China is an issue of concern, but slightly different character. And NATO is essentially, NATO is, to use that old phrase, or version of that old phrase, NATO is now back in business and back in area. That's why NATO was set up. That's why NATO is important for the member states. That's why NATO is now becoming more relevant to the security of the European nations. Other things could be added to that, but we should not forget the core mission.
Carl, thank you very much. Heather, over to you.
Just a huge thanks to our friends at Elcano. We have 5, thank you, absolutely. So for this panel, we have 5 experts, two cities, 1 moderator, and less than 45 minutes to dig into a lot of the conversation we just had with our leaders meeting. So, there we are. I see our friends at the Brussels Forum. So let me begin by bringing my colleague, Alice Ekman, Senior Asian Analyst from the European Institute of Strategic Studies. Alice is in our Brussels Forum studio in Brussels. Alice, can you hear me?
Yes, and I can correct that it's European Union Institute for Security Studies. Apologies for that, but important to correct.
Oh my goodness, I apologize if I misread that. I apologize. Alice, welcome. I wanted to start with you. We're going to dig into this conversation of NATO in an era of great power competition, because as you might have heard, we had a lively discussion, particularly with Prime Minister Albanese, on thinking through China. And what do you think the lessons that the Chinese government are learning from allied unity in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think China did not need Russia to draft a strategy towards Taiwan. That's important to have in mind. China's ambition to so-called reunify with Taiwan is in the pipeline for quite some time. Now, of course, China is certainly watching closely the recent development, but I think we should, I mean, it's very hard to guess what Xi Jinping and his advisors have in mind, and drawing the lesson, I don't really like this questioning, in the sense that I think China knows that it has several tools at its disposal to promote its strategy towards Taiwan, and the military option is only one of the many options that China has at its disposal. There is cyber attacks, information warfare, lawfare that is being used against Hong Kong in different terms, because the status of Hong Kong is of course different, but it's important to have this in mind. And also, I don't like really much the question of, I mean, drawing lesson, and it's not to be critical here about the format of the discussion, but it's more about, it implies that we draw rational lesson, or that Beijing or Moscow are drawing rational lessons from a situation that is rational. But the situation is not rational at all, I'm sorry to say. And we have been witnessing very clearly that economic rationality is not a driver of Beijing position towards Russian invasion of Ukraine. As you all know, the trade volume between the EU and China is much more important, much more significant than between China and Russia, but still that doesn't shape or readjust China's position towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine at all. A completely different example, far away from Ukraine, but that underline the, I would say, limited impact of economic rationality is the impact of the national security law that has been adopted in summer 2020 towards Hong Kong. It leads to a reduction of Hong Kong economic attractiveness, but the aim was a political gain. So I think if we have to draw a lesson, it's from the situation, is that now I think positioning is becoming more and more ideological, to a sense that economic rationality is not the main explainer or the main driver of Beijing or Moscow's positioning and cooperation in the long term. And I believe Sino-Russian relationship is much more than a marriage of convenience. I know we discussed about this, the nature of the relationship in the previous panel, but it's very important to underline that it's not just about energy cooperation, economic cooperation. It's much more than this. It's a joint cooperation in multilateral system to reshape global governance toward a post-Western order, that we'd like it or not. It is written black and white in the 4th of February joint statement. And it's also about coalition building. But coalition building in an informal way, not by signing formal alliance treaty, but by trying to challenge the current alliance system as much as possible. And as the previous panel mentioned, NATO itself is seen as an enemy, both from Moscow perspective and Beijing perspective. Wang Yi, the state councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs, in his annual press conference, mentioned that he sees the Indo-Pacific strategy as a new form of NATO in Asia that is not legitimate and doomed to fail. So the scene is clearly set here.
Elise, thank you so much, and I apologize again for mispronouncing your title. And I think you've really raised an important element, the irrationality. Do not analyze this through the lens of Western logic. It does not exist. Thank you so much. Let me turn again, also in Brussels, David Ignatius, columnist of the Washington Post and trustee of the German Marshall Fund. David, wonderful to have you. I wanted to ask you, because you have such great insights into not only where the Biden administration is heading, but the sort of the pulse of public opinion. Belgian Prime Minister De Croo has really made a point of saying, guys, this is a long, grinding war. We have to ensure our public understands that the sacrifices we are going to have to make. I would welcome your reflections on sort of how you view public opinion and certainly the political willingness to take the sacrifice that is necessary to allow Ukraine to win. So David, over to you. Thank you.
Well, first, Heather, I've heard from every European I've talked to here, and also the Americans, the same repeated insistence that over time Ukraine must win, Vladimir Putin's Russia must lose. That was the outcome of our debate last night, and I think it's strongly felt. And to succeed in that requires discipline and focus. So I worry about anything that dilutes NATO's focus at this moment of great challenge on that goal. It's going to require enormous discipline. It requires the opposite of dilution of effort or expansion of mission. So while I'm interested in the strategic concept that speaks of the Indo-Pacific as an area obviously of importance to NATO, I worry about completing jobs first. And the first requirement now is that NATO follow through in its support for Ukraine, in its protection of its own members and territory. The NATO alliance is built around what's supposed to be an ironclad commitment in Article 5 to mutual self-defense. And before we begin to think about extending that into the Indo-Pacific, begin a new phase of thinking about NATO expansion, let's make sure that NATO in its core home is succeeding. I just would make one final point, Heather. Looking back at the Atlantic Charter of 1949 that created NATO, it's really interesting that the preamble of the charter, while this was a defensive alliance born in a period of great power competition, insisted that NATO's purposes were aligned with those of the United Nations. Indeed, in Article 5 itself, the commitment to mutual defense, the promise that an attack on any one member is an attack on all, is immediately followed by a paragraph saying any such conflicts and response will immediately be referred to the United Nations Security Council, and the end of any such conflicts will be arbitrated in line with the Security Council. The advantage of that, I think, is that from the beginning, NATO was about enforcing this rules-based order symbolized by the United Nations. The United Nations has not been an effective vehicle for ensuring that rules-based order. But as we think about this new era, the new challenges, finding a way to see if the United Nations can be a more coherent instrument in alliance with NATO, in alliance with the other partnerships the United States has now in Asia, I think is of first importance.
David, thank you so much. I'm now going to turn back here to the panel in Madrid. Julia Ioffe, journalist, founding partner, and Washington correspondent of Puck News. Julia, I'm a groupie. I follow you on Twitter, so I'm going to be, true confession. You really have a strong sense of, the Putin regime, and I want to pick up on Alice's point about the irrationality of Putin's decision-making and how we as an alliance can try to make it as stable and predictable around that irrationality. And then exactly to David's goal, I mean, part of Russia's great power status was certainly being on the UN Security Council, and I think it sees its waning strength to align with China to preserve its own great power status. So help us understand as best as we can. Russia is trying to remain this great power, but the strategic miscalculations are it's accelerating its diminution.
So I would push back a little bit on the framework that Putin's thinking is irrational. Sorry.
I think that's not, you know what? Can we have a microphone? And I think that will help us immeasurably. If I knew where the microphones were. Do we have a microphone here, please, sir? We want to get all these words of wisdom. We need a good microphone for it.
What's that?
Yeah, I think it just needs a microphone. Or I'm going to come over to you and you're going to talk loudly. There you go. Let's borrow that.
COVID. I was going to push back a little bit on the. Here we go. I love you, but
Thank you. I know it's a little too close for comfort.
Thank you. That was good troubleshooting.
Oh, thank you. I'm always on Plan B. Resilience, NATO resilience. Ugh, got it.
So as I was going to say, is I want to push back a little bit on the framework of rational and irrational. I think the idea that the Western framework of thinking about things is rational and the Russian one is irrational is problematic. I think Putin operates within his own framework of rationality. It makes sense in his universe. It is rational for him. He has never been a great strategic genius. He is good tactically, and he kind of has a long vision and is really good at like kind of the short steps, and then everything in between it gets a little hazy. But I think in the sense of his point of view, this was unfinished business. He has become more and more interested in his own historical legacy and thinking about how he will be remembered in the history books, along with Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and I think he wants to be Vladimir the Great. So I think in his point of view, this was a very important war to start, and now he cannot lose. That is all in his kind of framework, that is rational. So I would caution against thinking about things as rational and irrational and try to enter the mindset of the actors we're talking about. As for institutions like NATO and the UN, I think if before Russia was trying to be part of these institutions, like what was once the G8, the UN Security Council, now it's about showing the hollowness of these institutions and using, the seat on the Security Council to undermine what the West is doing, to constantly, especially after what happened in Libya in 2011. It's said in Moscow that that was why Dmitry Medvedev didn't get a second term in the Kremlin, because his administration voted the wrong way in 2011. So, and I think that's what Putin was ultimately trying to get in the lead up to the war, was a veto power over European security within the kind of, or on top of the NATO structure. And I think that is where Russia and China share goals, which is to undermine the hegemony of the US, the post-Cold War hegemony of the US, in part by showing the hollowness of institutions like the UN, like NATO, by pushing constantly to see what they will do, how they will react, and then when they don't, you even have Volodymyr Zelensky saying at the UN Security Council after Bucha, what is the point of you if you cannot prevent atrocities like this?
I think you said it again almost yesterday at the Security Council over the bomb.
So he's even, Putin has even gotten his archenemy to admit as much to their faces. So I think your colleague is right that it's more than just an economic relationship. I think there's an ideological anti-Western alignment there too.
Well, let me go back to Brussels and bring in Carl Bildt, co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden. But Carl, before we dive into this, I want your statement on this historic day for Sweden. We'll get into the great power competition in just a second, but I want to hear what your thoughts are right now on this day.
Well, we aren't there yet. We have now, I guess, we will receive an invitation to start negotiations on membership of NATO. I hope those can be done fairly quickly. That's what Jens Stoltenberg has said. Then a process of ratification by all of the 30 members, and then we will become members of NATO. It is, of course, momentum decisions that was taken by the leaders or the politicians of Finland and Sweden a couple of weeks ago, as a matter of fact, after a very quick process after February 24th. And I do hope that we will get a fairly expeditious process until we can formally enter the Atlantic Alliance in the next few months, I would hope.
Well, yes, there's process, but I'm going to celebrate the moment indeed. So, Carl, help us understand where you think Putin is right now in his thinking, and how confident are you that Europe, the United States, our allies and partners do have the stamina to sustain Ukraine in the next couple of months? This is going to get even more difficult, I believe, in the following weeks and months.
this will get more difficult. War is an exceedingly costly business, and this war is likely to go on for quite some time. Putin is in a rendezvous, his own personal rendezvous with Russian history, and he's not going to give up. He is driven, I agree very much. I mean, he is, from his point of view, is rational, sorry to say. I mean, the only thing that I can compare with in sort of modern or semi-modern European history is, sorry to say, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was driven by his version, his mission out of German history, to make the Third Reich, the Third German Empire, to create a Lebensraum, as he said, for the German people, to get rid of the nation of Poland, which he considered to be something unnecessary created by Versailles. And much the same way with Putin. He has his own vision of a recreated Russian Empire, of getting rid of Ukraine, which he considers a threat to that particular vision of a greater Russian Empire. He's right in that particular respect. And his absolute conviction that the outcome of this particular war will determine his place in Russian history. He's right in that as well. But I think we need to be aware of the historical significance and the weight that he personally attaches to this particular endeavor. And that means that he is not going to give up easily, to put it very mildly. That means that we must have the staying power, both in terms of the military support, the political support, and the financial support, and the human support necessary to make it possible for Ukraine to survive and to win. Because if they were to lose and Putin were to win, which I consider nearly inconceivable, the consequences for all of Europe and for all of the global order, by the way, will be momentous in its negative implications.
Carl, thank you so much. I'm going to turn back here to Madrid with Luis Simon, Director of the Brussels office and Senior Analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute. Luis, you are a student, have been a long student of NATO, but from Madrid, you can always feel the tension a little bit from the challenges to NATO's east, but yet the challenge that still come and emanate from the south. And Madrid's and the Spanish government's strong concern that NATO balance that as we now look even farther afield in the Indo-Pacific. Help us understand from a Spanish perspective how, in an era of great power competition, can we balance these great powers, but also not lose that focus of the challenges that emanate from the South?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That's a great question. And thanks to the organizers, by the way, for a brilliant job. I think this is indeed a priority for the Spanish government. I think, and indeed there are multiple levels, because on the one hand is how do you balance the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. I think the South is sort of part of the Euro-Atlantic security picture. And my sense is that there is a growing consensus, and again, we need to see what the strategic concept says about this today or tomorrow, whenever it is released. But my sense is that there's a growing consensus within NATO that you cannot treat the eastern flank and the southern neighborhood as silos, because not least because Russia is actually increasingly present in the southern neighborhood, and in fact, I mean, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Mali, and multiple other places. So I think the feeling, certainly here in Spain, and I would say even beyond, is that Russia aims to sort of subvert the European security architecture. So it is poking wherever it sees opportunity. So it's not treating the East and the South as silos, but it's looking at it comprehensively as part of an integrated picture. And my sense is that NATO is sort of trying to adapt to look at it that way as well. Having said that, I wouldn't say that the main challenges coming from the South emanate from great power competition and from Russia and China. So I'm not saying that great power competition will be the main lens through which NATO will look at the South. There are transnational challenges there which are just as relevant, if not more, like terrorism, the climate security nexus and so on that we were discussing yesterday. But I think the great power competition lens will also be increasingly relevant in NATO conversations on the South.
Well,
Can I just jump in
please,
real quick?
please, I was going to.
Also, you have Russia trying to actively undermine the territorial integrity of Spain, right? By sponsoring and fomenting separatist movements in Spain. So.
Absolutely. I was going to say, then because of the product of the war and this global food crisis, we are going to see the crises both from food, climate. This is going to bubble up and certainly confront our southern NATO allies with a lot more challenges. Okay, I would like to do a quick rapid round, one question to all, rapid fire. Elise, I'm going to start with you. We have an amazing array of expertise here. So from your individual perspective, what are you watching for in the next coming weeks and months on the great power competition spectrum, something that you're watching closely as a sign of either NATO is strengthening and winning, or the authoritarians may be gaining. So Elise, what are you watching for in great power competition? Not maybe the 20th Party Congress coming up, or you're such an excellent China watcher, so help us understand what you're watching in the Indo-Pacific.
Unfortunately, none of us are excellent because the opacity surrounding the party is so big that we have to be modest here. But I'm certainly a China watcher. What I'm watching is China's diplomatic activism while we are focusing on Ukraine, and when we are meeting at this forum. China now is trying to revive the BRICS, which is not a security institution, as you know, but it's trying to say that it represents much more in terms of population than the G7 population, for instance. So China is also very engaged in trying to maintain Russia at the G20 and other multilateral forum that other countries would like China not to be, Russia not to be present. So China is very active diplomatically. It also has launched a group of friends at the UN, group of friends in defense of the UN Charter, group of friends for development, global development concept. It has also launched a so-called global security initiative. I mean, China is very active diplomatically at the UN and other institutions. We mentioned the BRICS, also the SCO is to be watched. And what I'm looking at is the battle of coalition, to be honest. While the alliance is reinforcing here and also clarified and strengthened in different ways, and also thinking strategically about adjustment, conceptual adjustment, and concrete adjustment. China, at the same time, sees the great power competition not just as a competition between Washington and Beijing, but between a group of countries, and has a coalition building strategy which is not completely weak, I must say. I mean, we should not underestimate China's potential to gather so-called friends around its concept and initiative, and because the objective, in the end, from Beijing perspective, is to marginalize ally. To say, sure, you may be strong, you may be consolidated, but in total, you're not so many countries in terms of voting power at the UN, or just in terms of population. We may disagree with that, but the initiative is very much active, and China is reinforcing this diplomatic activism by a communication strategy which try to push the argument saying that if the world is facing food shortage or other issues, it's because of Western sanctions. So basically the West would be, the cause of all the great trouble of the world. And in the end, again, I want to underline that, but Beijing is very much pointing at the US and NATO as the prime responsible for the war in Ukraine. Of course, this is far too simplistic, but it's important to see here that we have a full battle of coalition, not just in terms of diplomatic activism, coalition building, but also a communication war that I think needs to be addressed because we are moving far, far, far away from facts.
Well, Lisa, I mean, I just saw today that Iran is asking to be now included in the BRICS formulation, and you're right on communication. We are not winning the stratcoms in the global south, for sure. David, what are you watching for in the coming weeks and months? And I just would note that Putin has told us he is going to attend the G20, which will put a lot of pressure on whether other leaders will be attending that as well. But David, what are you watching for?
First, I think Russia and China, lacking the great gift that the United States has of having allies and partners, is looking for them. So we see Putin traveling to his neighbors, Tajikistan, I think, and another country on his periphery, the Chinese looking for allies in the BRICS. I think that's an effort that's late and is likely to cause as many problems for Russia and China as it does create benefits. The fundamental trends that I'm seeing, Heather, are that the center of gravity of NATO is moving east with the strength of the eastern flank, and north with the addition of Finland and Sweden. If the center point of NATO was somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, it's now a little further east and north. And I think that's good and important, especially at a time when NATO members understandably doubt the long-term staying power of the U.S. commitment to NATO through different administrations. I think we should talk about the efforts the U.S. is making in the Indo-Pacific to form other regional alliances. I'm interested that NATO wants to assert an interest in the Indo-Pacific, but the U.S. has done a pretty good job of developing NATO-like communities of interest in the Indo-Pacific to buffer the conflict between the United States and China. I think that's really valuable, that there not be one tripwire that then instantly gets you into an Article 5 world, but instead these good allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, other allies in the Indo-Pacific, maybe India in some form. And what I see ahead, Heather, is a common operating system for the network of partnerships and alliances that the United States leads in Asia, and the NATO alliance that the United States helps lead in Europe. The idea that the two would become the same and have indistinguishable obligations, I think we're a long way from that, but a common operating system for these alliances, defensive alliances of democracies, strikes me as really a good thing.
Dave, that's a really keen insight, and that need for, we call needing the bridge between the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific and building those more durable mechanisms, fantastic. Julie, what are you watching? Is it anything to do with Vladimir Putin's health? That's what I know, just teasing.
I think he's fine for a 70-year-old Russian man.
Okay.
Which, I mean, he's outlived much of his cohort, but I think he's fine. And I think the, attention to his health and the idea that if he were to die tomorrow is a lot of wishful thinking. I don't know that the war would end with his dying. Remember, he started his presidency with a manufactured war to give him legitimacy. I think whoever would come after him would have to do the same, probably by continuing this war. But I'm watching for two things, and they're much more granular. I'm watching, what's happening on the field of battle. I think that's just extremely important. It looks like Russia has been pretty successful in the Donbass once it kind of learned from its early blunders and refocused on a smaller area. It's now stepping up its attacks on Kiev and Mykolaiv on the Black Sea coast. Which is what a lot of us feared, that once they get most of the Donbass, they would start again trying for the, taking the bigger bite that they wanted to back in February. And the second thing I'm looking for is to see how China is going to continue, and whether China is going to continue walking this tightrope and kind of talking out both sides of its mouth, and if they're going to step into the breach that is left by the export bans, the technological export bans by the West, because Russia will run out of microchips and semiconductors, et cetera. And I'll be watching to see if China steps into that breach with spare parts, et cetera, that Russia needs to keep not just its economy going, but its army going in Ukraine.
So Julie, that's what I'm watching. And I think that's where, as an alliance, we're not prepared. If China does go full in and does support the Kremlin, the sanctions that would come from the U.S., the secondary sanctions that would have huge impacts on European economies, I watch that very carefully. Carl, what are you watching? You watch so much. What are you focusing on?
Well, first, I agree with everything that's been said. And let me add three things which I think are important. One is for NATO to turn into concrete reality what Secretary General Stoltenberg said the other day, sort of beefing up the Eastern Front. And that's not just giving a headline number, but I mean concrete units that are going to be there, the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, in order to really assure the security of the countries that are most exposed to what is now happening. Second thing, I was, to be quite honest, disappointed with the G7 in Elmau. I would have expected some sign of a readiness to discuss how to break the blockade of Odessa port, because that is extremely important both for the supply of food to the world. It's a global obligation, you might say, but also extremely important to the development of the Ukraine economy. But evidently one relies on negotiations through the UN with Russia. I can say with confidence they are going to go absolutely nowhere until they know, the Russians, that there are nations that are willing to do concrete things to unblock Odessa. Third thing, war is costly. Ukraine will need not only military equipment but also money. We are talking about $5 to $7 billion a month, or euros, in order to have the Ukrainian state sustainable without financing through debt and inflation and whatever. And the magnitude of that needs to be realized by the EU, by the US, and by the UK somewhat more clearly than we've seen so far.
Carl, thank you. Luis, what are you watching?
So thanks, Heather. There are a lot of things to watch, right? But I think if you're asking about the next few months, I would agree with Julia here. I think we need to pay attention to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, right? And in particular, whether there will be any more clarity in terms of the military and political outcome, what kind of footprint Russia will have militarily in the country, and how it will be geographically distributed. Because, I mean, this is a question that is very important as NATO continues to think about its deterrence strategy and its posture in the East after Madrid, right? And also as the US in particular, if we're talking about great power competition, as the US continues to think about how to prioritize, as you were saying, between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. Let's see what the national security strategy has to say about this. Let's say what the national defense strategy has to say about this in terms of force posture, but also force structure. And whether it's geared more towards Euro-Atlantic related contingencies or Indo-Pacific. And it's not a binary choice, but there are some trade-offs. And also going back to what Julia was saying, I couldn't be more agreement. Also, how all of this impinges on the Sino-Russian relationship, right? And whether China can manage to continue to have it both ways as it's trying to do.
Fantastic. Well, I have to say, the thing I thought someone might mention, but I'm really glad no one did, no one said the U.S. midterm elections. All right. So that's fantastic. All right. So we are going to do a two-city question. So if I can turn to my colleague, Ian Lesser, who's our GMF Brussels director. Ian, could you get us a question from our wonderful Brussels office? And then once that question is taken, I'm going to take a question from our Madrid office. So get your hands raised if you'd like. And then we will direct those questions in our last 3 minutes here for the panel to answer. Ian, over to you.
No, it's a hugely important thing that we do. I mean, you can lose focus on it's you know, it's a thing that we do that has long duration. You know, it has. Right.
I do magically have a microphone because I do have a question that I have been tapped to ask. So perhaps if you're able to hear me. So my name is Danielle Pitkevich. I am with the Young Professional Summit here. The issue with discussing great power competition is that we're looking at winners and losers. I'm over here. Sorry, everyone. We're looking at, it's not going to be as binary as a winner or a loser. And so if we're looking at a winning scenario, what does this mean? Of course, with Mr. Ignatius mentioned, we have distractions when we have the next crisis, when we have another pandemic, when fatigue sets in. What do we consider as a winning scenario? And is it going to be an economic, a military, or a winning scenario in values, or can we have all the above? So that's my question to you all.
Oh, fantastic. I'm going to shoot one to Fred Kemp here right in the front, President of the Atlantic Council. Is anyone with a microphone? If not, you can come up here and go to the podium, actually, Fred, if they don't have, oh yeah, Julia has a microphone. Fred, come on down, come on down. We got to share. Out, yeah, exactly. I could share my headpiece, but that didn't go too well the last time. Come on up here.
So, Heather, I'm going to disappoint you and ask the midterm election question.
But
I really want to do it for our non-American friends. Carl and others, obviously Sweden, Finland coming in, but at the same time, they're making a bet on the solidity of the U.S. future and U.S. future support of NATO. I'd just like to hear how the non-Americans in this panel are looking at this.
Oh, okay. So, well, maybe Carl, I'll send the midterm election question to you, and maybe I'll send our question about what do we win, how do we win. Elise, I'm going to turn that one to you. What does winning look like in the values, the economic, and the military field? So, Carl, go ahead and take the midterm question first, and then Elise, you can end for us.
Well, I'm not an expert on US politics. There are better voices available on that. I would be more concerned with the 2024 presidential elections, because who sits in the White House is, of course, critical to the credibility of NATO, to be quite precise. What NATO does in a crisis situation is very much dependent upon what the man or the woman sitting in the Oval Office decides to do. So that is fairly fundamental. But then, of course, we Europeans need to do more, no question about that, and you see that happening. I mean, nation after nation saying we have to do 2%, we have to beef up different structures. You have seen quite impressively in this crisis the European Union stepping up as a security alliance, the leadership provided by Ursula von der Leyen, by Mario Draghi, in giving candidate status, saying we take on a commitment to open our doors to Ukraine, to make it a member country of our union, is quite fundamental. But that will require further strengthening of European resources, and resources both military and otherwise in the years to come. So well beyond, with due respect to the midterm elections, well beyond that.
Well, Europe has got to stay strong no matter what. Elise, very quickly in our last few seconds here, what does winning look like?
Very difficult to answer that question. I think we have to be here rational and concrete. Winning is first and foremost military victory, because we are facing war. And I mentioned before communication war. I mentioned also ideological wars. I think these are very much ongoing, and I really dare to mention the word ideology, because you know, there is question about to what extent we are facing a war between democracy and authoritarian regime. It's a question that is asked to us, but it's also a question that is asked from another perspective. And from Beijing perspective, because I'm a China analyst, so I have to wonder what with Beijing perspective, is that yes, we are in a war of political system. In 2014, Xi Jinping mentioned that he believes in the superiority of communism over capitalism and the ultimate victory of communism over capitalism. You may disagree of what, you know, of the definition of it, and we may ask him what does he mean by communism or capitalism, but he sees the current global tension, not just in Europe, but elsewhere in the world, as a battle between political systems. And he believes that as a matter of survival for his own political system, it's important not only to resist democratic threat, but to fight back and weaken democracies. I'm sorry to say, but I'm convinced, there is no doubt about it, that China is engaged in a normative competition that is not just about competition for influence and for, you know, just becoming the #1 economy in the world. China and Russia converge in terms of ideology because they share similar political features, and they believe that democracies are a threat for their regime. So that said, yeah, I believe that we are engaged in an ideological war, and therefore it's important to fully take that into account to shape future strategies on member state side and institutional side as well.
Well, to win great power competition, you have to know why you're in the fight, and normative it doesn't get any more important than that. Colleagues, I have to confess to you, I have never moderated a two-city panel, so I think I've hit that on my bucket list. Just a quick shout out and farewell to Brussels Forum. I had to leave my own conference to come down to Madrid, so a wonderful farewell to all my colleagues there, and special thanks to David, to Carl, to Elise for really uplifting and insightful conversation, and then to my Madrid team here, to Julia and Luis. Thank you all so much for a rich discussion. I am so much smarter now than I was when I started this morning. Thanks to you all. And with that, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel. I was glad.
I had a wonderful replacement. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Heather, thank you. We missed you here in Brussels, but good travels. But we're going to move on here, and we're going to shift gears slightly and talk about one facet of what it might mean to be winning in the future, and that is to talk about tech trends today, tech trends tomorrow, and whether NATO is fit for the digital age. And we'll have a good, terrific, actually, set of people with us on both ends here again. But just to introduce who will be with us here in Brussels and to invite them to the stage, we'll have Casper Klinge, Vice President for European Government Affairs at Microsoft, and Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One, both great friends of GMF, and wonderful to have you with us. Please have a seat, and I'm going to let you have a conversation for a little bit. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Casper, thank you for joining us. And everyone, thanks for sticking around into the wee hours of day 3. So, yeah, we're told while we're waiting for their set change and setup like last time, we can riff a little. Casper,
which I'm very concerned about, let me say that from the outset.
Riffing, it's what ambassadors love to do. So we'll do a quick introduction. You are currently Vice President, European Government Affairs, which I guess makes you like the chief lobbyist in Europe for Microsoft. Maybe that's how I view that title. But tell us what. Please. How do you consider your role?
Yeah, no, so I think you're not too far away. Of course, we represent the interests of Microsoft in Europe, and we have a team of professionals both in Brussels and across Europe. And I think this is the place to be right now when you look at the regulatory agenda of the European Union, not least hitting digital companies or technology companies. We've seen it with COVID, we've seen it with the war in Ukraine. So what we're trying to do is fundamentally sort of align with the European agenda. So what I would say, Kevin, is we're also a little bit a lobbyist within Microsoft in trying to get the mothership to align with the European agenda.
Well, you had some experience with that. Previously, you had the great title of being ambassador to Silicon Valley, right? I mean, we were the first it was billed as from the Netherlands. How did that experience shape your perspective of now, being in a company working for Microsoft and now focusing on NATO? I mean, you must have a unique perspective being, you've worked for government, for private sector now, but focused on a multi-government, future with NATO's technology, initiatives that are on the table in Madrid today.
Yeah. Oh, it's very loud now. So I think, I love the country of the Netherlands. I did represent Denmark, but, it doesn't matter.
Sorry,
we're sort of Northern Europe,
sorry.
so, if there are any Dutch people here, we can talk afterwards if there's any interest of us coming to help out.
The Belgian Prime Minister mentioned Benelux, so, pick one. I apologize.
Not at all. I consider myself very European, so you're home free. I thought it would just be appropriate for me to point out it did not represent them.
Of course.
No, so I think the interesting thing about what we did, and by the way, many other countries are doing the same today, is to acknowledge that when you're a small country like Denmark or the Netherlands, what happens in the digital space, what happens with big technology companies, actually has a huge impact on sort of the national interest. And diplomacy has always been about putting people into sort of the hotspots of transformation. When you look at it historically, you put envoys into areas where you perhaps had conflicts or challenges. And I think in today's world, you actually need envoys that help translate from the public sector to the private sector, from the private sector to the public sector, what is happening on technology. Because I think what we're standing in front of, and again, the war in Ukraine shows that so well, is huge transformations driven by the technologies that a company like Microsoft is developing and deploying.
So I don't want to give up the goose of what you'll say when we go live with Madrid, but tell us a little bit about what you're anticipating, the work you've done in the last few months to push new policies for NATO technological transformation, innovation that you're looking for. You were talking backstage about work you've done with GlobeSec, for example.
Yeah, no. So I was privileged enough to be part of the GlobeSec Council, Future Security and Defense Council, and really trying to develop a report with some of the recommendations going into the NATO summit in Madrid. And it's a big report, and there were a lot of people in uniform part of the council. So there was a lot of what I would call sort of doctrinal recommendations. But if we zoom out and look at what the basic recommendation we made to the Secretary General was, it was in fact to create an opportunity for NATO and the private sector to come together at a moment where I think that kind of dialogue is critically important. And I don't know if I sort of revealed any state secrets by saying to you, Kevin, that we've been involved in this work for the last couple of years. You know, we've been knocking on the doors. I've been doing that with some of my colleagues. Many of them are here today. And the door was not always opened when we were standing out at the headquarters. And I think, of course, there is a pre-Ukraine and a post-Ukraine also in terms of how NATO is now, I think, increasingly acknowledging the necessity of working closer with the private sector. And I think that's a positive step forward. And let's see what comes out of Madrid. But I'm pretty sure and optimistic that we'll see some wording in the communiqué and in the new strategic concept that is going to acknowledge the necessity of working closer with the private sector.
Well, give me a little more detail on that, of what's the type of item on the list that wasn't received well pre-Ukraine that's now changed minds since February?
Well, I have to be very cautious now what I'm going to say. You're trying to get me in trouble here. I actually worked for NATO for a couple of years, so I think it's fair to say I'm a fundamental believer in NATO. I think it has played an incredibly important role in the last many decades, now more than ever before, perhaps. But it's also fair to say that NATO is a conservative organization where it takes a little bit of time for it to sort of adopt to a new reality. So I, in fact, don't think that what we experienced was unexpected or problematic. What I'm just saying is that there is a new reality. Countries, as you mentioned before, are now beginning to send envoys to the technology industry. And I think whether you look at the European Union, whether you look at NATO, even the United Nations, are also beginning to look into a new geopolitical reality where technology is going to be such an important part of it. Look at the cybersecurity aspect of the war in Ukraine. I think it's sort of a no-brainer to all of us today why it is that we need to adapt to a much more different threat scenario. And I think NATO is looking at that direction, and I think that's a really important step.
We've heard a lot about the cyber record of the war and why did Russia not do as much as was perhaps anticipated. I know the strategic concept that everyone's waiting to find out today what's in it. We got a preview from NATO's own Assistant Secretary General, who's on the panel in Madrid. Once we get that, I might be getting a note about it. I'm not checking my Twitter, I promise. I'm actually getting notes from the producers on my phone.
It's because you're deeply concerned whether we will actually make the connection, is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, I'm good with Twitter. I'm not that good. But part of what's expected in the strategic concept is that 10 years later since the last one, is we're going to get something that widens out beyond tanks and aircraft and traditional kinetic military power as defensive needs for the alliance, to cyber, supply chains, cloud, all these new areas that individual countries, especially back in Washington, are already pretty far into, as more than a large alliance can be. So, coming from Microsoft, what are you hoping to see in that concept, and what does that mean for the kind of products, networks, solutions you're going to have to create or hope to create for the member states of the alliance?
Yeah, I mean, let's see what comes out, and I haven't seen a version of it, but I think it's fair to say that we should sort of expect that what began at the London summit, the discussions around emerging and disruptive technologies, the consequences for NATO, I think that discussion in many ways will be culminating in Madrid later today or tomorrow in a new strategic concept that is going to acknowledge both a number of thematic areas. I mean, we've been speaking a bit about cybersecurity, I think artificial intelligence, cloud computing, quantum computing. I think those are areas that will not only be important if you want to create economic growth in Europe or in North America, they are in fact also becoming technologies that are going to have an impact on threat scenarios or the geopolitical situation around the world. So I think those are going to be important parts of it. And then, I have to say this, and it'll come as a shocking surprise to you. I think for us in the private sector, having wording both in the communiqué and in the strategic concept about the necessity of creating an interface between NATO and the private sector to discuss some of these issues, I hope to see that, and I think it would be, as I mentioned before, an important step for NATO, but frankly speaking also an important step for the private sector to increasingly acknowledge that we have a responsibility, whether we like it or not, to actually help ensure that NATO remains sort of the place to go in terms of technology, in terms of superiority in defending our societies, our values, and our approach.
In fact, that's one of the more recent ideas section commentaries on Defense One is calling for that exact thing, that NATO needs to codify or put into language more cooperation between industry and the states in developing everything that is expected to be needed. I'm told that they're still working on their mics and miking up in Madrid because, Spain, what are you going to do? But here, but it's a nice climate, it's warm. So we're going to take some audience questions if you like. So I can let's see, hands up. We have this one in the back here. Maybe someone has a microphone to come around. Maybe not. Yes, coming. One moment, coming up behind you. Here you go.
Thank you. It's better than Madrid. I'm going to ask a hard question here. I know that your ambassador title comes from your previous work with Denmark, not Netherlands.
Thanks.
However, it seems to me that one company cannot be at the table. If you're at the table with NATO, you are no longer private, you are public. And so we're now talking about public infrastructure. So I would like to talk about the transformation for companies that have become essential infrastructure like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon, into something that can really be a part of the public sphere. We need a new theory and a new model for this kind of dependency, in my opinion.
Listen, I think it's a fair point to make, and needless to say, we're not arguing that we need a place at the at the NAC or at the UN Security Council if you make the UN comparison. I think what we're saying is that the private sector, especially those that are involved in critical infrastructure, as we've seen with Ukraine, and whether we like it or not, it's on our software systems, it's on our cloud systems that we see some of the more vicious attacks against the Ukrainian society, and I think that makes it impossible for us to say we can be completely neutral here. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat or overdo what a company like Microsoft is doing in this area, but I think it is about leaning in and acknowledging that we don't have the answers. We're not the ones that need to define the governance structures of tomorrow, but we do have a responsibility for being a societally responsible player, including discussing what we see in terms of threats arising, for example, around cybersecurity. And I think that's the conversation we've been taking forward, and where, as I told Kevin before we went in here, and he promised me not to say it in here, but he did nonetheless, that there was a little bit of a distance before Ukraine talking to NATO. That distance is smaller today, but I think we need a number of different actors to be involved in those discussions.
Thank you. So, as you can see, we are connected to Madrid. We'll go live to them and listen in.
In the new strategic concept, and one which was being discussed at great length, at least prior to the 24th of February, which slightly interfered with many of our pre-existing plans, as you all know. And we have a wonderful panel, which is going to be moderated by Natalia Drozdiak, and she works at Bloomberg, where she currently covers NATO and EU foreign policy, but prior to that, she specialized in technological issues for some 6 years, and so I hope that she doesn't mind us dragging back into her former field of expertise. Natalia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have the pleasure to introduce a wonderful panel. We have David Van Wiel. He's the Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Down the line from Brussels, we have Kaspar Klinge. He's the Vice President for European Government Affairs for Microsoft. Back here in Madrid, Alejandro Romero. He's the Chief Operating Officer for Constella Intelligence and the board member of Telefonica Tech. We also have Francesca Bria, who's running a bit late. Her flight was delayed. She's the president of the Italian Innovation Fund, and she should be joining us any minute now. But we're going to get started right away, and I want to start with David. I want to take a bit of a step back and get your sense in terms of what we can expect and how tech will revolutionize the military going forward. I mean, can we expect like robots fighting robots? Paint us a picture.
Well, it's very difficult to look into the future, but if I look back into the past, which is easier to do, then innovation has always won wars. From the first man-made weapons to the invention of gunpowder, the use of horses, later the introduction of aircraft, innovation is critical when it comes down to maintaining the edge of your adversary in a conflict. And for years, we've been very well placed to have that technological edge. because a lot of the inventions, the great inventions that we all know from the 20th century, originated in the military domain. Think about the GPS, the Global Positioning System, the Internet, or something simple like duct tape. They were all military inventions that later got a commercial civilian use. Now we have an issue at the moment as NATO and as militaries that a lot of the innovation nowadays comes out of the private sector. So it is being developed by startups, scale-ups, larger tech companies, academia, and it is predominantly designed for commercial use. And that's great. I mean, if you look at the innovation potential that we have in the Alliance, it's huge. We have 9 out of the 10 best universities in the world on our territories. We have 80% of all living Nobel laureates living in allied countries. 65% of all the venture capital going around in the world is being invested in allied countries. So we have a great basis, but we have an issue with translating that into the defense sector. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I'll start with one of the obvious ones that I think our colleagues from the private sector will recognize. We're difficult to deal with. We have long procurement processes. We have very strict requirements to what we think we need. So we leave little room for the creative minds, the innovators, to actually give us new technology. There's also a lot of unknowns, both sides. So a lot of the military operators don't know what's out there in the field of technology. And a lot of the technology developers don't know what the military would actually need in times of warfare. So we need to connect those two worlds. And I think that's what we're trying to do at NATO now, is to transform ourselves into an organization that is more connected to the innovation ecosystem, the private sector, academia, and the small startups and innovators that are making a difference in the world of tomorrow. So to finish off this first intervention, the 2 initiatives that the leaders are endorsing these 2 days in Madrid are the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or DIANA in short. I still think it's one of the best acronyms in NATO because it actually sticks to your mind. And the other one is the NATO Innovation Fund, which is a $1 billion venture capital investment fund that will invest in dual-use deep tech. So what DIANA does is reach out into those innovation ecosystems. Don't come to us, we'll come to you. It will be making use of accelerator sites that are existing in all the other countries, reaching out to the innovation community with military problems. For example, how can I communicate underwater over a distance of 100 kilometers? And then let's see what comes out of that first contest that we do. And if we get great ideas out of that, then we will actually sponsor startups. We will give them grants and we'll coach them, we'll mentor them, we'll expose them to end users in order to mature their product. And if they make the second cut, we'll give them even more money to mature their product, and then we'll make sure that we advertise that to all the allies and the industry. And the NATO Innovation Fund is a venture capital fund which can then at that stage come in and provide pre-seed and Series A financing for these startups, which is very difficult if you're working in the dual-use defense market because private capital is very hesitant to step in. So I'm not saying that we're going to change the world with these 2 initiatives. I would love to say that, but it is only a small first step in order to regain our contact with the deep innovation that we've lost over the years.
So Alex, I mean, from the private sector, what are your thoughts on NATO's new initiative here? Is this, what type of impact could this have? And I mean, just generally speaking, what gaps do NATO allies have when it comes to tech and securing that competitive advantage?
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I want to build up on what David just said. I think that the initiatives that the NATO is taking along the lines of the DIANA initiative and the NATO Innovation Funds are, really relevant, and I believe from a private sector in the right direction. I encourage NATO to be more aggressive. If I take the example of the NATO fund, it's around $1 billion to be spent over 15 years. And if I take only one industry, cybersecurity, and only one country, Israel, and if I add the aggregate of all the funding rounds of the last year is 8.8 billion. So this gives an idea of the order of magnitudes that we need to attract in this space and in a critical area like cybersecurity. And then in terms of further collaboration, I think that there are multiple areas in which collaboration with the private sector can be improved. You mentioned a very important one, which is procurement. But I believe that in the private sector and also in the defense sector, we are facing talent shortage, lack of talent. So, for example, in cybersecurity, there are as many people working as open positions in the industry. So being able to access talent at a scale is something that is also an area of concern for us, and where we could be collaborating with NATO. I think also cooperation on threat analysis. If we look at, for example, critical infrastructure, a significant amount of the critical infrastructure is owned by private companies. A collaboration or a close collaboration between private companies and allies and NATO could be also relevant. And then finally, I would like to bring the attention on public awareness. I believe that especially in the younger generations, raising awareness about the relevance of defense, raising awareness about the potential dual use of technology is very relevant in order to understand the role of NATO and how critical this is for the defense of the allied countries.
So I'm going to see if we can check in with Kevin in Brussels down the line. Kevin, can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Can you? Yes, we can.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
So tell us.
Yeah, I'm here with Casper Kling, the Vice President from Microsoft. So we just heard a lot about NATO's efforts for innovation, which are often focused on startups. And it's assumed that's where the creativity is coming from. But you're here from Microsoft. That's not a startup. That's one of the largest firms in the world. So how does that music play in your ear? Is that and how does Microsoft respond or fit into a future that's focused on innovation and startup land when you're coming from something a little different?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Kevin, and good to see everybody on the Madrid end. And I'm going to disappoint you because it's going to be very difficult for me to disagree with what David said. And I know I've been enormously annoying towards David in the last 2 years because I've been knocking on his door to try and sort of get a conversation going. Because I think one of the aspects that David laid out so well was, of course, that in today's world, civilian companies, including a company like Microsoft, the technology that we develop and deploy, again, whether we like it or not, is used also in the military domain or in the military space. And if we just use a couple of minutes to talk about what we've seen in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, I think the interesting aspect is that even before the first missile or the first shot was fired, the war had already begun through severe and significant cyber attacks that only increased in the months and in the days before the 24th of February. So I think it also shows that in today's world, it is not only about territorial sovereignty in the traditional sense, about having soldiers on the ground. If we want to protect our societies, our institutions, our democratic values, we actually also need to make sure that we have a virtual defense up and running, and this is where the private sector comes in. And I think people around the room or in Madrid will probably know that we've been incredibly engaged in also trying to support the Ukrainian authorities with state-of-the-art technology to try and defend them against cyber attacks. And I think, again, if we talk about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cloud computing, many of these issues will have an impact on NATO, which is why I think what we will see come out of Madrid today and tomorrow is going to be, quite a dramatic and quite an important step forward in bringing NATO from the London summit, focusing on emerging and disruptive technologies, to actually creating a framework where NATO will align more with the new digital reality, but will also enable NATO to work closer together with the private sector, even big startups like Microsoft.
Yeah, and even if I get a quick follow-up before I throw it back to Madrid, even if the new strategic concept says, okay, we also believe that cybersecurity, supply chains, AI, those are all important tools, weapons, whatever you want to call them. What does that mean? How does that help foster new technologies, get the solutions faster to the tip of the spear, to the warfighters and the commanders who need them immediately.
But I think, as David mentioned, there are some specific steps being taken. I think Diana is an important step in actually creating a completely different approach to procurement. Instead of saying, here's a problem and these are the specifications for the solutions to that problem. I mean, NATO is, in my view, or as far as I understand, going to say, here's a problem, come with a proposal how to fix that. And I think that brings back the innovation to sort of the collaborative efforts around NATO, but I think it also brings more awareness, not only to a big company like Microsoft or some of the other big players, but also to startups or small and medium-sized enterprises, that there is an opportunity to work and fundamentally support NATO with technology that is going to be absolutely decisive, not only in terms of building the jobs of tomorrow or creating economic growth, but actually also in making sure that NATO will defend the societies that we live in.
That's good. Diana is a better acronym than Wonder Woman, I think. but good for the memory, as I said. So Madrid, back to you.
Take it back now. And I'd like to introduce Francesca. She managed to join us, and I want to get your thoughts. NATO's has this innovation fund, 1 billion euros, but the EU is also making some efforts in this area. Why is there such a focus on deep tech in particular? And also, Alex mentioned dual use. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Is that a better investment case from your perspective? Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think I will continue to emphasize what was already said in terms of the need of innovation in dual-use technologies, because there is a huge opportunity for these disruptive and emerging technologies to emphasize not only the ability in order to tackle our national security objectives, but also our broader objectives as society. So the UN development goals and the kind of human rights agenda. And I think broadly, really, the defense of our citizens' ability to be safe, secure, and have their rights protected as a democracy. And I think there is a need not only to have those kind of standards and requirements and security, let's say, by design. So security-centered world. Imagine when we are talking about quantum cryptography or smart cities or even digitization of energy infrastructures, these kind of IoT scenarios where it touches everyone's life. So there the alliance, this kind of public-private partnerships, the kind of triple helix alliance between the private, the public, and academia, society at large is very important. When it comes to financing innovation, I think if we do not see the need for patient long-term capital in funding deep tech, which is the disruptive emerging technologies that will lead us to reshape the future, I mean, of course, it's capital intensive. It needs exactly patience, and we need to bet on the actual talent that can scale. So there we need to pull in large-scale public investments that can be like mixed funding. It can be a mix of grants, a mix of equity, or even venture capital funds. So when it comes to the EC, the European Union is becoming very, I think, ambitious now, because it's always being seen as a kind of regulatory power for the digital age. So betting on the ability to regulate and to put democracy at the center of the future vision of technology. But now, obviously, we understand we also have to compete on technology and innovation capabilities, and that's why we created the European Innovation Council, which has a 3.5 billion venture capital fund. This is the first time that the Commission does something like this, and also 1.2 billion in mix of grant and equity funding for deep tech scale-ups. And another initiative that's very important to me and ambitious, which is the European Technology Champion Initiatives, which is a 10 billion multi-partners and multi-governments fund, which is managed by the European Innovation Funds with 16 governments that are already part of it. And the ambition is to create the next 100 VC funds in Europe to grow deep tech champions. And I think this is a great opportunity because we can then create this pan-alliance innovation ecosystem where we bring together, of course, the defense capabilities, because it has to be built with security, ethics, and the capacity to protect our citizens in mind with standards that we need from the security community, and then public investment that can leverage 3 or 4 times private investment. And that's, I think, where we're going to have a real capacity to protect our industrial capacity, our industrial base.
So we've been talking a bit about the gaps that NATO as an alliance has in terms of tech, but from the EU and from the US in the fight against in the war in Ukraine, we have seen some sanctions against Russia on the technology front. And I was curious to get your thoughts, David. You know, what are we seeing in terms of impact already on the ground in the war there?
Well, we're either already seeing the impact or we will be seeing the impact very soon, because especially the ban on sophisticated semiconductors is going to have a huge impact on the production processes, the production lines of military equipment in Russia. So with sanctions, you always hope to expect that within 24 hours they will kick in. They don't. It takes time. But in time, they will hurt. And in specific technologies, it will be very hard for Russia to build up that capacity on their own. Of course, apart from the West, there are other producers, and of course, China is a big upcoming player in this field. But it takes time to change your production processes. So I think we will see difficulties on the Russian side as a result of these sanctions. At the same time, it is heartening to see that innovation on the Ukrainian side has taken a huge flight. Kasper already mentioned the cyber attacks, and Microsoft has done some great work in mitigating the attacks and moving Ukraine to the cloud. So just as an example of the role that the private sector nowadays plays in these kind of conflicts. But we can all now sing along the Bayraktar drone song as an example of new technologies, rather cheap technologies if you compare it to a fighter jet, that are having a huge impact on the ground in Ukraine. Or the use of artificial intelligence language processing to translate all the intercepted Russian communications and then search for different worlds. The use of facial recognition to identify the human rights violators in Bucha. It is a great example of a whole of society effort that is now going into keeping Ukraine safe and upgrading and innovating their military as they fight. Now, I'd rather have we don't wait for a conflict like that, but learn from what we see and make sure that we institutionalize that cooperation between the private sector, academia, and the government in order to provide safe technology, rightly said by Francesca, based on our values, because that is what distinguishes us from our adversaries, is that we are democratic nations, we have values and principles, and these need to be translated into our new technologies as well.
Should we check in with Kasper to get his thoughts on the war in Ukraine, especially on the cyber front, and also just more broadly, you know, where can NATO as an alliance improve on the cyber front? Microsoft had a report recently about Russian cyber espionage. I'd be curious to get your thoughts, Kasper.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. But I think again, we have a situation where there has been sort of a pre-Ukraine and a post-Ukraine approach to how we look at cybersecurity. And there's nothing new about cybersecurity. I think most of us have been arguing for many, many years that this is a threat that we have to protect ourselves against. I think what we've seen now is the coming together of cybersecurity attacks together with kinetic activities on the ground at a scale that we perhaps haven't seen before. And I think the sort of foundational conclusion in this is that we have a hybrid warfare in Ukraine, perhaps at a level we haven't seen before, and the response to that has to be a hybrid response as well that involves also the private sector. And you mentioned before some of the work that we've been doing. I think it's fair to say it hasn't been particularly easy. One of the reasons it hasn't been easy is because many of the Ukrainian authorities were actually hosting their data sets or their infrastructure on-premise, in other words, having servers in the basement that were easier targets also for Russia and trying to knock out the sort of critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So one of the areas we've been investing a lot in is to try and migrate, in fact, 16 out of 17 Ukrainian ministries to the cloud in order to try and defend their ability to have functioning institutions and services up and running despite the war on the ground. But you point to a number of other areas that are increasingly important as well, which is, traditional espionage. We've seen a rise in attacks against, in fact, 42 countries outside Ukraine conducted from Russia, which has been sort of more traditional espionage, but I think also basically disruptive in its nature. And we've also seen an increase, a quite dramatic increase in what you could call sort of cyber influencing campaigns that I think we don't need to talk too much about what kind of impact it has on our societies. And I think when you put all of that into the same basket, what do we need to do more of? And this is one of the discussions we've had with David and his team for many months and years, is that, if we look at cybersecurity, a company like Microsoft, like many other companies, we have access to real-time threat intelligence, and making that available to NATO through some sort of interface mechanism, I think is one of the areas that we need to look into. I think we have an obligation as a company, similarly to what other speakers said before, about fundamentally helping to protect democratic institutions and the values of the societies that we live in. And by the way, the values that is also the place where Microsoft originates from. And that's what we're trying to do by leaning into the situation right now.
Kevin, just checking if there's anything you wanted to add or if you wanted to jump in. Otherwise, I'll turn to Alex.
The strategic concept that we're all anticipating today is supposed to reflect a lesson learned and change how NATO thinks. And physically, what do you think of traditional military hardware? The idea is that NATO shouldn't have just enough on the eastern border to absorb a Russian attack that might literally take over and invade the eastern countries, and then NATO can then figure out a solution to push back and respond. The new thinking is there will be enough firepower deployed to deter that attack to begin with. What's the cyber version of that? What's the technology version of that you think is the future ahead, where it's not enough to just wait for those attacks and play defense as a defensive alliance, rather something new and the new strategic concept has to be put forth?
So I think the lesson learned from Ukraine, but of course also from some of the previous major cybersecurity attacks that we've seen in the last couple of years, is of course that no industry, no government is going to be left untouched by that. And I think building up appropriate resilience is going to be critically important. I mean, in my past life, when I was still working for government, I was stationed in Southeast Asia when NotPetya happened back in 2017. Almost exactly on the day we're sitting here. And I remember quite clearly how that crippled a number of very big international corporations in a way that they were unable to conduct business. And I think that was a wake-up call for some industries and some sectors. We can say very little good is coming out of the atrocities on the ground in Ukraine right now, but perhaps one of the things that we can use Ukraine to do is to build up more awareness of the need to do more. You need to protect yourself. We need to protect ourselves as a company, but we also need governments, academia, institutions to do more to protect themselves. And I think there is a technology solution to that, and of course, like many other companies, we're heavily involved in that part of it. But there is also a regulatory aspect of that, where we're seeing the European Union, not least in these months, actually providing, I would say, sort of a wave of different regulations that are going to increase obligations for all of us in having state-of-the-art technology to protect ourselves against cybersecurity attacks. There might be another aspect to this, which I think is interesting when we look at NATO and the discussions that are ongoing, which is sort of the more normative dimension of emerging and disruptive technologies. I mean, can NATO, similarly to the European Union, create a Brussels effect where you actually help set the standards around the application of new technologies in the battle space, in the military domain? And I think that's a really interesting way forward. I don't know whether that will be in the communiqué or in the strategic concept, but it might be an area where NATO could look into in the coming years.
Well, we can send it back to Madrid, and maybe David can tell us. He's from NATO. He knows what's in the strategic concept, right?
Yeah, but I can't tell you yet, because then I'll be spoiling the news coming out today. But I can promise you that all that's been discussed here is featuring very prominently in the new strategic concept. We realize that this is a critical part of the future of warfare and defense and deterrence. And to make it concrete on the normative front, we're already starting to do that, because we realize that these technologies need to go regulated, especially if we use them in the field of defense and security. So last October, for example, we published our AI strategy. So that's an AI strategy, but only focused on the use for defense and security. And a large part of that consists of principles of responsible use. And for those who work with AI, they're not mind-boggling or groundbreaking. They're about fighting bias, they're about meaningful human-machine interaction, they're about lawfulness. But these principles are key to our innovators that are working for defense and security, because they want to design technology that is actually aligned with our values and not being misused. It's key for the end users, because military end users working with AI want to have a level of trust in what the technology that they're operating will actually do. And thirdly, and that's what Casper said, the Brussels effect, it also sends a signal to all the Western companies, and hopefully beyond, that these are the standards for new technology that we expect all to adhere to. So that was only AI. The strategic concept will mention that in more broader terms as one of the roles that NATO can play. We don't do hard law like the EU, but we can set standards and norms and make sure that if we at 30, or since yesterday at 32 soon, agree on what we find the acceptable standards, then hopefully that will have an effect far beyond the NATO territory and make the world a safer place.
Alex, I'm curious to get your thoughts. I mean, from your point of view, where do you think NATO can improve on the cyber front? And just secondly, I mean, since we're talking about the strategic concept, we know that China will be mentioned, and we expect that NATO may call out their control of critical infrastructure. And I'm curious to get your thoughts. I mean, given that telecom is such an important aspect of that, you know, is this threat exaggerated? And I mean, if it isn't, what can NATO do to reduce that reliance? Thanks.
Okay, I would like to build up on what has been said by Casper and by David, and add 3 key learnings we are having at the cybersecurity space based on the war at Ukraine. The first one is, I believe that NATO and the allies should be doing much more in terms of awareness on civil society, on the threat in the cyberspace. Different research shows how the perceived threat of civilians changes significantly based on the distance to the border with Russia. But in the internet, we are all neighbors. So we are all neighbors of Russia or of China, of Iran. And you know, cybersecurity on the digital space, it's certainly a threat that should be perceived by civil society regardless of where you are geographically located. The second key learning, and building up on what Casper said, the move of a lot of the infrastructure that was on premises to the cloud has really made it life more difficult for the bad actors. So what we are observing in the cybersecurity space is that bad actors are going to areas or towards areas of less friction. And the areas of less friction are humans. So basically trying to replace the digital identity of politicians or executives is one of the key vectors attacks that we are observing both in APTs, in advanced persistent threat actors, and also cyber criminals. I'll give you one example. We released recently an analysis on critical infrastructure, on energy, and we discovered that 45% of the top executives of the largest 20 companies, energy companies in the world, had credentials exposed in deep and dark web. And more we see how this can be weaponized and can be used to first penetrate an organization and then move laterally in order to attack these organizations. We have also some interesting examples, but actors like Lapsus are poaching employees of critical infrastructure companies, offering them 20, 30K a week just to provide credentials to access critical infrastructure. So I think identity is going to be definitely, as the security in the cloud increases, an area of interest. And then finally, I want to raise awareness on a third element, and Casper was talking about the coordination of kinetic action and cybersecurity and cyber action, wiper attacks and destructive attacks. We see a third element that we believe is very, very important, which is disinformation and malign campaigns. More and more, we are talking about APTs, advanced persistent threat actors in the cybersecurity space, but we are also coining a term of APM, advanced persistent manipulators. In the Ukrainian war, we have seen how Russia has been very effective crafting very divisive narratives against the allies and NATO outside the Western world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And that represents an important threat that also needs to be taken into account.
And on the telecom front, with the China threat, can you tell us what your thoughts are there?
Well, I think in general, and I wouldn't limit this to infrastructure, but obviously supply chain is going to be a critical element, because supply chain can be significantly weaponized. And we have recent examples. The SolarWind attacks are a very, very good example on the impact that the supply chain can have across a country, a region, or the world. And definitely, as we jump into 5G, and we are already talking about 6G, as IoT is becoming a critical foundation of our industries and our lives, supply chain, and that includes obviously telecom infrastructure, are going to be very, very relevant, and definitely needs to be an area of very deep focus from a regulatory perspective, but also from a defense perspective.
On the capability side, I just want to check in with Francesca, and then we'll go to questions in the room here and in Brussels. So why don't you can start thinking about them while I ask Francesca. On the capabilities side, China and Russia, I mean, how far behind is the EU and the US in certain areas? And what is your main concern?
I think what was said for me in the panel is very important. That is to push the higher level ethical direction, and then get the democracies through also international regulation and agreements to set the principles and standards, also via experimentation, testing, standard settings, and then get the investment behind. Because I think this is our strength. Our strength is that we recognize how those disruptive and emerging technologies can bring lots of benefits. I mean, not only for the defense industry and in kind of war scenarios, but also broadly. But if they are misused, they can be detrimental to our democracy and our fundamental values. And what was mentioned, for example, threats around disinformation and around kind of pervasive manipulation of data and technologies, I think this will become also a key issue. It has been mentioned, the cybersecurity regulation, the information security regulation, the AI Act, and also what NATO is doing in that front, but also the Data Governance Act. When it comes to people will need to have trust. They will need to feel that they can own their digital assets. They can own, their data and their identity. We also have to understand, and this is linked to kind of massive digitization of people identities, payment systems, cryptocurrencies, all kinds of new services are being introduced in society. So this goes beyond, only the scenarios that we are talking about. And I think for me, this kind of vision that we may have as allied, as democracies, to make it happen with those very strong ethical direction is what I think we should use as our competitive advantage. So I don't think that, because usually we say regulation makes it slow and we need to agree all together in a democracies and we're going to be beaten because China, it's going to be faster and they're going to outperform us. But those technologies are being going to be pervasive throughout society. They have to integrate to the institutions of society we have today. So if we do it right, and if we are convincing people that we may keep the open and safe society, yes, with our technological improvements, then I think we will have an edge. We will have this edge that is not only technological, because digital sovereignty is also economic, political sovereignty, and of course, the military sovereignty.
I think that's a very optimistic note to wrap up on.
We have to, because otherwise, we know, I mean, all the rest, it was said, you know, material scarcity, food crisis, supply chain disaster, supply shock, I may say, but also, again, the data is going to be a big fight because there is a lot of power asymmetries, and we have the fight for talent also, because we need these STEM capabilities to be here. So we need to attract the more talented people. We need to be a better university, better education, better public sector in order to leverage the capacity throughout society. So the challenges are many. I think we need to be optimistic that as democracies, we can have an edge. We can have a competitive capacity here.
So let's check in with Brussels. Kevin, is there anyone in the crowd there that wants to ask a question?
We have a question set up for you right here.
Hi, my name is Owen Daniels. I work at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Technology literacy is a key challenge in both the civilian and defense sectors, particularly so policymakers can know the levers that they have available to them when it comes to emerging tech. I was wondering what the panelists think about how NATO can or should promote tech literacy both within the alliance and then also among member states. Thank you.
What do you think of that right here in the room?
I think the first thing is to say I think it's a really great question, because I think you're pointing to one of the areas that I know, David, the rest of the NATO organization is focusing on, and increasingly also we're focusing on the private sector, which is to make sure that the gap between where policymakers are and where the technology is, that gap is being reduced as we go along. So actually, I think one of the interesting aspects of your question is, why do we want an interface between the private sector and NATO? What's the interest for Microsoft in this area? Well, I think we have a couple of different interests. One is to make sure we help educate, a very important defense organization about where technology is today. And I'm a simple political scientist. I'm not an engineer. So it's been a steep learning curve for me to come into Microsoft and sit in front of our engineers and understand how fast the deployment and development of AI is, or quantum computing. And don't ask me any follow-up questions, because I will fail completely on that one. But I think the interesting aspect is, even for those of us that are working in the private sector, we see in many ways an unprecedented pace in the development of new technologies that is going to have a profound impact on the world, on geopolitics, on the opportunities to create the jobs and the growth of tomorrow. And that requires us to work closer together. But I actually think I just wanted to come back to the point just made. One of the areas we're investing in Microsoft, but many other companies are doing the same, is in fact on skilling. And we do that for two reasons. One is a very selfish thing, which is we can't attract the number of cybersecurity experts that we need for our own business today. So to those that are a little bit younger than I am today, go into that area. There are huge opportunities in terms of employment. But the other reason is, of course, we live on the basis of trust. Now, if you don't have trust in our technology, you're not going to use our technology. And the problem with cybersecurity, and if you want me to be a little bit tedious, if you look around the room here today, because what we say is so incredibly boring, most of you are sitting with your device in front of you and probably reading emails or tweeting or doing something more interesting. And that, of course, also shows the vulnerability we have, because we are connected today, and cybersecurity is going to be one of those aspects. So in order to increase awareness, we also need to invest in skilling and developing more competences in those areas. And I know that our friends in NATO do not disagree on that one. And by the way, we're here to help together with many other companies, both on the other side of the Atlantic, but certainly also here in Europe.
Thank you. Madrid, back to you.
I think we'll have to leave it with Casper. And I just want to thank all the panelists, David, Alex, Francesca, and down the line, Kevin and Casper, for this wonderful panel. Just a note to the crowd here in Madrid, we'll take a short break now. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good job.
Worse.
Very good. I think we have Ian here to send.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Casper, thank you very much. Pleasure, thank you. So before we actually close out Brussels Forum, we thought it would be a wonderful idea to have, a great friend actually of Brussels Forum, but also a very keen observer of all the issues we've been talking about, come out and share with us some thoughts about, some reflections on what he heard, and maybe even a little bit about what we might discuss next year. And so in order to do that, we're really delighted to have with us Professor Timothy Garton-Ash from Oxford University. Timothy, please join us. So tell us a little bit. You've started out Brussels forums, you've listened to them. What did you hear a little bit, and what do you take away?
So I have 2 or 3 benchmarks for you next year to see where we've got to. It was a terrific forum, congratulations, some fascinating sessions, and very good news from Madrid on Finland and Sweden. The first one is, have we stayed the course for Ukraine? We need, Olaf Scholz the other day at the Katholikentag, the Catholic meeting in Germany, asked the question, kann man Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen? Can one create peace without weapons? Well, one might ask the question at an academic seminar, as we like to do in Oxford, but the answer is no. If you face someone like Vladimir Putin, you need the weapons, and we actually need to send in a lot more weapons, fast, and the ammunition, and $5 to $7 billion a month to sustain the Ukrainian economy. And as we face a cost of living crisis in our own countries, a likely recession, possibly a hint of Eurozone crisis in relation to Italy, possibly a touch of refugee crisis because of the food shortage in the Middle East and Africa, I fear very much that our publics and our politics on both sides of the Atlantic are going to falter and not be prepared to stay the course. Only if we stay the course will we have a durable peace in Ukraine, a situation where Vladimir Putin cannot plausibly claim to have won. Of course, he can still claim to have won, but not plausibly claim to have won, and Ukraine can plausibly claim to have won. So that's my first concern.
What else are you concerned about? What else worries you looking at the situation? You talked a bit about the political, sort of staying the course politically, but there are other things to worry about, no doubt. What else?
So another word that has been buzzing in my head in this whole forum is the word narrative, because it seems to me that we in the liberal democratic world, Europe, dare we even say the West, are doing many things right, but we're losing the battle of narratives with our own publics, with the publics in the authoritarian states we face, be it Russia, China, Iran, or Turkey, and crucially with the global South. I mean, if you just look at the war in Ukraine, I've mentioned the concern about our own public. We're doing a very bad job. I mean, one of the greatest sessions here was the one on the future of Russia. I don't know how many of you attended that fantastic breakfast, talking about how we get the message through to people in Russia who are critical of the war. We're doing a very bad job of getting the message through that our quarrel is with Putin, but not with Pushkin. And that's a crucial message. Our quarrel is not with Russia. And in the global South, we are absolutely losing the battle of narratives. Food shortage, food price hikes, it's your fault, West, it's your sanctions. No, it's Vladimir Putin's fault. And for me, really sobering is the world's largest democracy, India. If I try saying to Indian friends, hey, the Ukrainians are actually fighting an independence struggle against a war of recolonization, which is what is actually happening, against, if you will, a Russian Raj, that argument gets nowhere at all. So I think we have to find much better ways, and when we come back next year, we can see how far we've got with that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you've given us great pointers for that. If you'll allow me maybe just to ask you about one more, well, perhaps it's not a worry, we'll hear. the quality of democracy in the West. I mean, this is at base a transatlantic conversation, and we've talked about the foreign and security policy dimensions, the geopolitics, but there are things going on in our societies, I'd say in my own, in the United States, obviously. Say a word about that.
Well, you can't tell a good story unless you have a good story to tell. And our problem is, I thought Senator Murphy was very interesting on this, very frank about the state of American democracy. But look at Hungary, look at Poland, look at many of our democracies. So first of all, we have to put our own house in order. I mean, by the way, I spent a lot of time working on the history of the Cold War. By far the most important thing the West did to win the Cold War was not anything we did in our foreign policy. It was keeping our own societies strong, attractive, prosperous. It was the magnetism of that. Can I say one other thing quickly? Every crisis hides an opportunity. The bigger the crisis, the bigger the opportunity. And I see a big opportunity in this crisis. I've just finished writing a history of contemporary Europe, and if you look at it from the mid-1980s through to the early to mid-2000s, there's one of the biggest upward and forward movements in European history. I mean, we really made enormous progress towards the great goal of a Europe whole and free. Since 2008, financial crisis in Georgia, it's been crisis after crisis after crisis. Think about it. Financial crisis, Eurozone crisis, Ukraine 2014, refugee crisis, Brexit, Trump, Poland, Hungary, COVID, and now the invasion of Ukraine. Need I go on? But I see an opportunity given us by the extraordinary Ukrainian resistance and the pushback that we have had. And I think the most important decision made in the last 3 weeks is the European Council decision on candidacy for Ukraine and Moldova, because I see a real opportunity for which the key institution is actually not NATO but the EU, to start a new forward movement of the Eastern enlargement of the key institutions of the West, starting this time with the EU. Of course, it's a tall order. Of course, it has to be done differently this time. We have to look at models of staged accession. But the opportunity is there, a big strategic opportunity to advance the frontiers of a Europe whole and free, which is in a way a great Brussels Forum theme.
Absolutely.
And by the way, last word, if we succeed in that, if we succeed in extending the frontiers of Europe whole and free into Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, importantly, then at the end of the day, this is going to be our most successful Russia policy. Because at the end of the day, if we succeed, Russia will have to wake up to the fact that it has lost an empire and has to start finding a role. And as Britain shows you, that can take a long time, but we hope we get there in the end.
Timothy, thank you very, very, very much. You've not only told us a great deal about what we heard, but also about what we might talk about next year, and we really thank you for that. Thanks
Looking forward to it.
so much. Well, we've come to the end of Brussels Forum 2022. I hope you'll agree we've had really an extraordinary 3 days and evenings, actually, of conversation across many, 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 many subjects. I think you've also heard, and it's very appropriate on the 50th anniversary of GMF, a good deal about what we do, in fact, and whether it's about civil society or leadership or all the policy work that we do, whether it's about geopolitics or cities or about disinformation. There's so much that's going on, and that's one of the wonderful byproducts of this, is that you get to hear about that. You heard a good deal also about a possible Marshall Plan for Ukraine, and that's so appropriate on the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan as well. Let me just say that overall, our mission, which is very simply to strengthen transatlantic cooperation, is more important, more relevant than ever against the backdrop of a war in Europe. What else can one say? But I believe in the basic truth of that. Going back to what Heather said in her opening, we have a mission, actually, and that mission is extraordinarily important today. Let me just say some thanks. You have to do this, and it's right to do this, and it's essential to do this. First of all, to our partners in this Brussels Forum. To our founding partners, the Belgian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, to Mercedes, to our strategic partner, Amazon, to our forum partners, Google and Nato, and actually all the other partners, and there are many of them that have helped us make this happen. It does not happen by accident. It happens because we have the resources and the intellectual help to do it. So sincere thanks for all of that. Let me also say a very, very sincere thank you to our staff here at GMF. We have, between the staff and the volunteers who are with us, about 80 people here. That's quite an extraordinary ratio of participants to staff, and I hope you share the view that that really does make a difference. This does not happen by accident. So a huge thank you to all of them. Some of them many of them are in the room. Why don't you stand up? I mean, the staff who are here, and the volunteers, and also to let you know that there are some probably missing because they're upstairs in our offices doing, hard at work making this end properly. It was a very complicated year for many, many reasons, not having done this in person for a few years, but also because we had this wonderful link to Madrid, which was hugely valuable, but also not the easiest thing to do always. So thank you for hanging in there with that. Let me say a very special thank you, finally, to two very special people who really do make this happen. To my colleagues, Nicola Leitner and to Louise Longeby. Please come up here and join me, please. Thank you. We did our COVID tests this morning, so really, really tremendous thanks. Finally, thanks to all of you for joining us. It really does make a difference to have real people in a real room in person. I think you'll share that. The virtual bit adds something, and we'll keep that, but it's not quite the same. And it's been a great pleasure to have you here all with us, despite all the travel difficulties and everything else. So just to say goodbye to you all, to thank you again, but also to wish you very safe travels, and we see you again next year. Thank you. Oh. Goodbye.